The structure of the Mountain Shell Drip Sweet Wine starts with cueing the questions, where I try to highlight that there are a lot more questions that we ought to be asking than the standard kind of permissibility questions, that there are other questions of function and characterization and content and these sorts of things that help us recognize the rich variety that we see in Scripture. After that, in the section called Arriving at Answers, start to look at the different types of alcoholic beverages in chapter 2 that we find. That it's not just wine, for example. I think one of the things that often happens with this topic is we assume that we're just talking about grape-based alcohol. But I think there's also grain-based alcohol, and I get into that a bit there. In the next chapter, I look at the ways that people have talked about dilution and dilution habits, and have typically sort of painted with a broad brush and sort of articulated that here's how everybody did it, that they tended to do dilution at this ratio or that ratio. Try to highlight that there would be a lot of diversity, and actually raise the question, how frequently or at all would ancient Israelites, for example, have diluted their wine? So that's a question that needs to be asked and not just assumed. Moving on, looking at the economics of production of wine and beer in the ancient world. And sometimes when we think about a topic like that, we might just assume that, like, oh, everybody had access to wine and wine was everywhere. And of course it was everywhere. But there's some questions to be raised about how often wine would actually have been consumed and by whom. And we see some interesting things going on in Scripture, especially as it relates to the kind of elites in ancient Israelite society, the kings who had access to wine, etc. That's a focus there to actually address the economic issues around wine. Beer, for example, would have been much more accessible, the kind of thing you could make any day of the year, whereas wine, you could only make at harvest time, and only if you, for example, had land in which you were growing grapes, right? So the accessibility issue is something that needs to be addressed because it is often just assumed. Carrying on from there, I look at the way that wine is associated with covenantal passages in Scripture and covenantal promises, and highlight those connections, that it has to do with what God is doing for His people. That's a rich part of Scripture. But then also, because God is providing the abundance of wine through the provision of land, through the weather, through these different things that come from God's providence, ancient Israelites would conceive of their production of wine as a gift that they would then give back to God. And that's in the temple system, in the temple cult. And the tithes, the offerings, even the libations that would be poured out in sacred space, whether the tabernacle or the temple, highlighting that dynamic from there. After that, I look at the issues of restrictions and prohibitions that pertain to alcohol. Why is alcohol prohibited in certain places? Where do we see that mentioned? How does it relate to certain types of people or in certain types of spaces? Because there's a question that I think we need to ask, which is, does the Bible prohibit or restrict alcohol consumption for all people at all times? It's often assumed that it's yes, there's a yes or no issue here about the prohibition of alcohol, but there's a lot of nuance to how the prohibitions, the restrictions work. So I try to highlight that. But then the question becomes, well, why do certain people in the Bible abstain from alcohol? Because there are a handful that do. What are their reasons for doing so? And that's the next chapter there. Then try to look at how drunkenness works in the Bible and highlight how oftentimes it really is a matter of vulnerability to sexual exploitation, physical violence, or divine judgment. That's one of the main things that the Bible has to say about drunkenness, is how it relates to the kinds of things that can go wrong when someone is drunk. And that's a key thing there. Then I have a set of chapters that really kind of have a kind of narrative sort of dynamic to them, looking at how the exile leads to the loss of the land that Israel has been given, leads to a privation of the blessings of wine and beer and these sorts of things. That that's a key part of this set of imagery, the loss of God's vineyard, as I like to say. And then looking at the theme of the cup of wrath, and this is a whole set of images that are really, the kinds of things that we might not want to look too closely at, because it's a set of harsh metaphors that seem really kind of intimidating. But there's a lot of rich stuff going on there, and it has huge implications for what we think might be going on, for example, in Gethsemane, when Jesus says, "Let this cup pass from me." So that's the cup of wrath. After that, looking at the themes of eschatological abundance and eschatological banqueting. So ancient Israelites, when the prophets would imagine what would it be like for God to restore all things, they imagined an abundance of wine, that wine would drip down mountains, as the book is called, drawing upon Amos and Joel. So looking at this expectation of an era of abundance in prophetic literature and even in the New Testament, and then shifting to, in the next chapter, the eschatological banquet, specifically the idea that era of abundance would sort of be inaugurated with this kind of initial meal that would set it off, and that would characterize this era of abundance as a time of feasting. And so that's looking at that in especially the prophets and in Jesus's life and in his ministry. Culminating in the next two chapters, the final two chapters of the Arriving at Answers section, looking at how the Last Supper and the Lord's Supper, commemorated subsequently, is sort of this culminating point of these themes of feasting and different things in those two chapters, looking closely at what the Gospels and what the letters especially have to do and have to say about the final meal that Jesus had and how that meal is replicated in early Christian worship. So that concludes the Arriving at Answers section. Finally, in the reflecting on relevance section, I close out with practical thoughts and application and reflection about everything that we have seen, noting how all these different varietals, these different sets of images that the Bible contains, all sort of culminate richly in how we think about the Eucharist. That all of these different themes of covenant and kingdom, even the cup of wrath, all these things culminate in the Eucharistic celebration, and really highlighting that. But then reflecting on these different types of things about, okay, so what does this mean for us today? For example, those who abstain from alcohol, do they need to have biblical justification for their abstinence? There could be any number of reasons to abstain, and they don't all need to sort of boil down to this passage or that passage. It could be very mundane reasons. You just don't like it, or you're trying to lose weight, or whatever the case may be. But then there could be real serious reasons that don't really have to do with the Bible. It could be interpersonal, social. It could be because of familial patterns of abuse. It could be because of genetic dispositions. There could be so many reasons not to drink. And just highlighting that no matter what we do with a topic like alcohol in the Bible, whether we drink or we don't drink, we don't need to have some kind of biblical justification for not drinking. For example, you can just not drink. You don't need, for example, to interpret the text in poor ways to arrive at the fact that you don't want to drink. You could just abstain, and there's a million different reasons to abstain. But what I want to highlight throughout the book too is whether we drink or whether we don't drink, that this biblical theology of alcohol is for everyone. It's for everyone who loves their Bible, because our Bibles are soaking with alcohol. There's so many references to alcohol, and to just sort of avoid them or ignore them or not consider them, factor them into what's going on in the biblical narrative, I think is a poor use of Scripture. That Scripture has all of these dynamics, and we don't need to drink alcohol to appreciate them. For example, if, let's say, you had undertaken a Nazirite vow to abstain from alcohol, and you were at the wedding at Cana, you would abstain from this wonderful wine that Jesus made, but you still get to appreciate the blessing of the experience of everybody having this joyful occasion at the wedding. You don't need to personally consume it in order to benefit directly from it. And I think it's a similar sort of thing. We can benefit from what the Bible has to say about alcohol without personally consuming it. That's not a prerequisite to appreciating it. So we don't need to have bad uses of scripture and bad arguments about how it's not actually referring to alcohol, or it was actually all diluted. We can set those bad arguments aside because you don't need this sort of like biblical justification not to drink. If you don't want to drink, don't drink. You don't need to interpret scripture poorly in order to arrive at a position like that.